SMU political science professor Matthew Wilson, thank you so much and welcome back to Eye on Politics.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So here we are days before the March 3rd primary, and the U.S. Senate race on both the Republican and Democratic side is one of the most fascinating races we've seen in Texas in a while, no?
It is. There's genuine uncertainty about the outcome on both sides. I think it's highly likely that the Republican race will go to a runoff. It'll be interesting to see who is the leading contender going into that runoff. But the Democratic race really could go either way, and it is almost certain to be decided on Tuesday because you really only have two major contenders. But the polling and the betting markets are saying different things about the outcome of that Democratic race, so it'll be interesting to watch.
So let's start with the Republicans. Three-way battle, like you said, likely to go to a runoff. How damaging is that to Republicans?
Well, I think ideally the party would prefer not to have that because that means that Republicans will spend another 6 weeks attacking each other. They'll spend another 6 weeks to 2 months spending money that could be going towards the general election effort. So it's not ideal, but they've been in that situation in some races in the past and it's turned out to be okay. But definitely whoever emerges from this will be somewhat damaged by having had attack ads run against him through the course of March and April by another Republican.
It's likely to be a Paxton and Cornyn runoff, right? But each of those campaigns has spent millions of dollars attacking Wesley Hunt, the Houston congressman, and seemingly they want to keep him out of the runoff. Why are they doing that?
Well, here's a really interesting feature of this race. Wesley Hunt would have a very good chance of actually prevailing in a one-on-one matchup against either Ken Paxton or John Cornyn.
Why?
Because most of John Cornyn's supporters like Hunt better than they do Paxton, and most of Ken Paxton's supporters like Hunt better than they do Cornyn. Because Hunt's whole case is that he is a diehard conservative, not part of the establishment, but who also does not have the personal baggage that Ken Paxton does. So he argues that he's the kind of ideal middle choice between those who want a movement conservative who is unencumbered by ethics scandals, personal lapses, etc. That could be a pretty compelling message. And therefore, I think both Cornyn and Paxton have been eager to make sure that Hunt finishes third, and so that if they're in a runoff, it's not against him.
In one aspect, is Hunt getting into a runoff good for Republicans?
I think ultimately the powers that be in the Republican establishment in Washington would be fine with that. Their main goal, that is the powers that be on the Republican Senate side, they don't want Ken Paxton as their candidate because Ken Paxton has a lot of baggage. They think that he could imperil the down ballot races even in the state of Texas. So they'd rather see Hunt at the top of the ticket. If there's a runoff between John Cornyn and Wesley Hunt, I think the Republican powers that be could live with that however that were to play out. So Hunt being in a runoff would not necessarily be bad for the party. I don't think it's a particularly likely outcome though.
And let me ask you, because many people like you expect this Paxton-Cornyn battle in a runoff, and it will be a battle royale,
Yes.
right? I mean, we've already seen some of the nasty ads between those two.
Right.
So what would that be like, in your opinion? I mean, I don't know that we've ever seen perhaps a more contentious race between the two.
That would be a very bitter, very acrimonious sprint to the finish. I think we would see a doubling down in the intensity of the attacks. There would be a lot of vitriol and interpersonal bitterness that would come out of that. A lot of money would be spent. And so I think that's a fairly likely scenario in terms of what we'll be looking at through the course of March and April and into May is those two gentlemen, if they in fact do emerge in a runoff against each other, trading some pretty deep and serious barbs. And I think that it will get more nasty and more combative than what we've seen thus far.
And President Trump has stayed out of this race. Everybody asks him all the time, and he stayed out. He says he supports all three. My question to you is this. If this gets into a situation where you have Paxton as the Republican nominee and the political baggage, et cetera, and just going down that scenario, let's say the seat is flipped. Let's say one of the Democrats is able to beat him. How much of it do you pin back on President Trump for not coming out and making an endorsement early in this race for any of them, but especially for Cornyn?
Well, I think there will be some Monday morning quarterbacking if, in fact, that's the scenario that plays out. And President Trump's really in a bind here because I think it's true when he says, I like all three of these guys. That is, none of them have been opponents of President Trump. They've all worked with him in various capacities. He would clearly support any of the three of them over a Democratic opponent. But he's torn between the fact that his Republican allies on Capitol Hill are telling him, we really need John Cornyn as our candidate in this race, versus the fact that Ken Paxton has been such a Trump loyalist and has been such a MAGA presence. And so I think that's why Trump thus far has punted on making an endorsement. He doesn't want to come out de facto against any of these three candidates. Now, the pressure on him to say something will ratchet up if we get to a runoff stage, which is highly likely, and they'll want him to weigh in. But he's going to assess, I think, whether one candidate or the other is clearly in the dominant position. Because one thing we know about President Trump, he does not like to put his reputation on the line by backing a loser. And so he's only going to come in for a candidate that he thinks has a very strong chance of ultimately prevailing. So he's going to have to make that strategic assessment.
Last question on the Republican Senate primary. And this goes back to when we first spoke about this when Paxton got into the race in April. And that is, for Cornyn to win, he has got to increase the size of the primary electorate, whether it's on March 3rd or May 26th. Do you see him doing that?
That's clearly what he's trying to do. It's really interesting because, of course, voters in Texas are not registered by party. And so people who are more centrist, they can choose to either vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary or not vote at all. And I think that Cornyn is really trying to persuade a lot of those more centrist folks to show up in the Republican primary to cast a vote for him and against Ken Paxton. Now, the other dynamic, though, is if those people choose to vote in the Democratic primary in March, they can't then turn around and vote in a Republican runoff in May. And so if, in fact, you've got some persuadable voters who are voting right now in the Democratic primary, they're off the table for Cornyn if it goes to a May runoff. So that's the kind of strategic dilemma that he's in.
Right. Once you pick your party, you got to stay in it.
For at least that cycle.
For that cycle. So let's talk about the Democratic Senate primary. You talked a little bit about before. This really could go either way between Crockett and Talarico.
That's right.
And talk to me about the dynamics of that when people, because I've talked to Democrats and they, in many cases, were struggling to figure out who they were going to vote for.
That's right. And there really is a conflicting message coming from the polling versus the pundits. And most of the punditry, most of the political wise guy class, if you will, has seen Talarico as the favorite. Talarico has been very much a kind of darling of the national educated Democratic elite. They think that he has the secret sauce that might allow them to break through and win a Senate seat in Texas. Jasmine Crockett, though, has built a considerable national following through her extensive social media presence. And, of course, we should not underestimate the power of African American voters in a Democratic primary if they could be mobilized in large numbers. And of course, she has very strong support within the African American community. So it really is a question of what subset of the Democratic electorate chooses to participate. Is it the young, very online activist class? They tend to like Talarico. Or is it some of your more traditional bases of Democratic support, like African American churches, community organizations, et cetera, who may line up more for Jasmine Crockett? And I think that's going to be really critical to determining the outcome. But I will say, come Tuesday night, one or another set of people is going to have egg on their face. Either the pollsters, who have kept telling us that Crockett is in the lead, either their polling is going to turn out to have been wrong in terms of capturing who the Democratic primary electorate is, or all the people who are in the betting markets and doing national political punditry who see Talarico as the next big thing in Texas Democratic politics, they're going to be wrong. So one or the other is going to have some explaining to do come Tuesday night.
And you know, there are so many different little storylines, the differences between the two in the sense of what their message is. On one hand, you've got Jasmine Crockett saying she is the fighter who will go up against, who has gone up against President Trump, will go up against President Trump, will go up against the Republicans. And on the other side, you have Talarico, who is trying to bring everybody together. He always says it's not right versus left, it's the rich versus everybody else. And he goes after the billionaires. He says he wants to build a big tent. What do you make of that dynamic as far as the messaging is concerned?
Well, the difference between the two of them is almost entirely stylistic. I can't point to a single major issue where I think Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico would take materially different positions. So it's all about style and presentation. Crockett has a feistier, more combative style. Talarico has perhaps a more conciliatory style. But that doesn't mean that they would take different stances on the policy questions that they'd have to vote on in Washington. So voters are going to have to ask themselves on the Democratic side, A, which of those styles do they prefer, and B, which they think is going to be more effective in the fall campaign trying to take this seat from the Republicans. That's an open question. But I think that really is the key dynamic here. Likewise, one of the things that people have really noted about Talarico is, oh, he's a person of faith, and this is such a departure from what we usually see from the Democratic Party. But again, that's really more about style and presentation than it is about issue positions. Because on the things that typically religiously committed voters in Texas care about, things like right to life issues, school choice, role of religion in public schools, gender and sexuality issues, James Talarico takes exactly the same positions that secular Democrats do. So there's a style, there's a presentational difference that's much more profound than any actual deviation from party orthodoxy on the issues.
And that could be an issue in the general election if he gets in, right?
That's right.
Because the Republicans are going to make hay of that, right?
That's right. That's right. I mean, he was famously quoted years past as saying, God is non-binary. That'll be an interesting quote that'll run through some evangelical churches in the state to say, how does that resonate with you?
So let me ask you one other difference that I've noticed, and that is in their campaign tactics. Because when Crockett came into the race, she said, look, we cannot run as we always do in Texas, trying to attract Republicans and independents. We have to bring in new voters like President Trump did and President Obama did. Bring new people out to vote. And Talarico is more on attracting the disaffected Republicans and the independents. And it's going to come down to that too, right? Isn't that a big potential here for a deciding factor?
Right. Crockett and Talarico present two different theories of the case to Democrats about how you win as a Democrat in Texas. Talarico's argument is this is a state that still leans Republican, and therefore for a Democrat to win, you have to be able to draw in people from the center and even center-right into your coalition. Jasmine Crockett argues that Texas is not so much as a Republican state as it is a demobilized state. And therefore the key for Democrats to win is to turn out ever greater numbers of African American voters, Latino voters, young voters who have not participated in the electorate in the past. So it's a big tent strategy versus a base mobilization strategy. And they're really two different visions of how Democrats might finally be able to break the 30-plus year losing streak.
I did ask Talarico just yesterday about, he casts himself as the underdog. And yet, he still insisted he's the underdog, despite the fact that the Stephen Colbert interview and the blow-up catapulted him as far as searches, and he raised $2.5 million in a 24-hour period. Plus the fact that he has spent all of the ad money for him, by him, etc., is $21.5 million according to Ad Impact Politics versus $4.5 million for Crockett. So when he insists he's the underdog and yet he's spending more, he got a lot of publicity out of that Colbert interview, does that really wash, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a stretch. He is the underdog in the sense that he has frequently pulled behind. So from that standpoint, sure, you could cast him as the underdog. However, he has an enormous campaign war chest. He's attracted a lot of money, particularly in recent days. He is, in many ways, the darling of the national Democratic chattering class. They've been pointing to him for a while as the great hope in Texas. So he certainly has gotten a lot of very favorable publicity nationally. So in that sense, it's hard to kind of position him as the scrappy underdog. Scrappy underdogs don't get extended interviews on Stephen Colbert, right? That shows that he is very much on the radar screen of some pretty powerful elite forces in national Democratic politics.
Last question about the Senate race and this Ad Impact Politics, which tracks advertising spending, says it's the most expensive Senate primary in U.S. history, over $110 million. And it's going to keep rising because we're likely going to have a runoff. What do you make of that?
Well, Texas is a big, expensive state. There are multiple media markets. If you're going to be competitive, you've got to be advertising in Dallas, Fort Worth, and in Houston, and in Austin, and in San Antonio, and in El Paso, and then just traveling around the state and mobilizing block walkers and canvassers in all these different metro areas. It's an expensive proposition. And Texas, as I said before, is the key in many ways if Democrats are going to have a hope of capturing a Senate majority. And so a lot of Democratic money is coming in here, and Democrats nationally think they may just have the perfect storm with dissatisfaction with President Trump, a midterm environment that is likely to favor the party out of power, as it typically does, and a potentially damaged Republican nominee. They think maybe everything comes together to give us a shot. That's going to be an attractive prize. That's going to draw in a ton of money from around the country, and that's what we're seeing happen.
Several more questions. Let's just talk briefly about early voting. So far through Tuesday, Democrats have almost 137,000 vote advantage on the early vote. And so what do you make of that?
I think it's encouraging for Democrats. Typically, they are outvoted in primary turnout by Republicans. Now, typically also, Democrats don't have anything particularly interesting happening in their primary races. This time they do, not only in the Senate primary, which of course is quite interesting and hotly contested, but some congressional primaries like the Julie Johnson, Colin Allred contest here in the Dallas area. So there's more than there usually is to draw Democrats to the polls. Plus, we know around the country that the Democratic activist base is very, very angry at the Trump administration and highly mobilized to participate in an effort to try to rebuke the Trump administration. We've seen that in special elections around the country. So it's not surprising to me that we have robust Democratic turnout this cycle in the primaries. If I were a Democrat leader, I would be encouraged by that. At the same time, it's important to put it in context. We're still talking about less than 10% of registered voters in this state who have shown up at all. So what this is measuring is activation and enthusiasm of the activist base, which is good. Question is, how does that translate to activation of the broader electorate come the fall?
Reports that have dug deep into who has come out and voted early show that on the Democratic side, people who have voted only in the general elections and people who have no history of voting have outnumbered those who voted in the Republican primary, 236,000 to 91,000. What does that suggest, and is that potentially an early sign of trouble for Republicans?
I think it's something to be concerned about on the Republican side. Now, some of those people who have not participated in the past may be Democrats who just weren't particularly excited to participate in Democratic primaries in Texas because there wasn't a lot to choose from. There wasn't a lot of action or energy on the Democratic side. But that said, there's no doubt that there is some discontent right now among independent, moderate voters with aspects of the Trump administration and their policies. And that's something that Republicans are going to have to combat in the fall. And they're going to have to increase enthusiasm among their own base to match what we're seeing on the Democratic side. So I don't think we should read too much into the turnout numbers in the primary cycle. That said, I'd certainly be more encouraged by those numbers if I'm on the Democratic side than if I'm on the Republican side.
SMU political science professor Matthew Wilson, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We appreciate it.
Uh-huh.